We call this one carefully, because it asks us to bend a familiar shape around a story that does not quite fit it, no auction block, no dusty crate of trinkets. No rusted padlock waiting to be pried open with a borrowed crowbar. This is a story about a woman, a mill, and a stranger who arrived with nothing but 2 hungry children and a proposition. We think you will find, before the end, that the secret was there all along, waiting in the timbers of a building everyone in town had already written off as worthless. Settle in. She was 36 years old, and by the first hard freeze of that November she had exactly $11 to her name, 2 children who looked to her for supper. And a bank note her husband's death had made due in full. The man who held that note, a soft-spoken banker named Elias Marsh, had already sent word that her house and her fields would be his by spring if she could not make good on what was owed. All she had left standing, the one thing the bank could not touch because her late father had deeded it to her outright, long before her marriage, was an old gristmill on Amity Creek that had not turned its wheel in 11 years, a ruin of gray wood and rusted iron that her father had bought for $40 from a man who wanted to be rid of it. And that everyone in town now called, not unkindly, the Fool's Mill. It was into this ruin, and not away from it, that a stranger named Jonah Pratt walked one bitter evening in December, his 2 children half frozen behind him, and made her an offer that would change everything neither of them yet understood was buried beneath their feet. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Eleanor Voss. If you are watching this from a place that has been counted out, written off, or left to the weather by everyone who once claimed to care for it, tell us in the comments. We would love to know where you are watching from tonight. Eleanor Voss had not been born to hardship, though she had been raised to expect it eventually, the way a farmer's daughter is raised to expect frost. Her father, Amos Reed, had built the gristmill on Amity Creek with his own hands in the years just after the war, when the town was hardly more than a river crossing and a trading post. And he had raised Eleanor inside the rhythm of that place, the low groan of the wheel turning, the sweet dry smell of cracked wheat, the particular quiet of a mill at rest on a Sunday. She had learned to read grain the way other girls learn to read scripture, by running her fingers through it and knowing, by feel alone, whether a batch had been cut too green or dried too long. Her father used to say that the mill did not lie to you, that it told you the truth about the harvest whether the harvest wanted to be known or not. And Eleanor had carried that lesson with her long after the mill itself fell silent. When she was 19, the railroad survey moved its planned line 11 miles to the north, and with it went most of the mill's business. Since farmers now hauled their grain toward the new depot instead of down to the creek. Her father held on for a few more years out of stubbornness and love, grinding what little custom came his way. Until his heart gave out one October morning with his hand still resting on the very wheel he had built, and Eleanor buried him on the rise above the mill pond and locked the door behind her. She married not long after, a quiet, steady man named Daniel Voss who worked a modest homestead a mile upstream. And for a while it seemed the mill's silence had become a private grief rather than a public one. Daniel was gentle with her in the particular way of men who have learned early that gentleness is a kind of strength, and together they built a life that, if it was never rich, was never once unkind. They had a son, Caleb, quick and watchful even as a small boy, and a daughter, Ruth, born with her grandfather's stubborn chin and her mother's steady hands. Eleanor taught both children, almost without meaning to, the same lesson her father had taught her, that a thing left idle was not the same as a thing without worth. That the mill sitting silent on the creek was not proof it had nothing left to give, only proof that no one had yet asked the right question of it. She kept the building swept and the roof patched out of a loyalty she could not entirely explain even to herself. Paying a few dollars a year from the family's thin savings to keep the worst of the weather out, long after any neighbor would have called it a waste of money. Daniel never once told her to stop. He used to say that a woman who tended a ruin the way she tended that mill was a woman worth building a whole life around, and for 11 years that is exactly what they did, quietly, together. On land that asked more of them than it gave back most seasons but never once broke them. It was this quiet, then, that made the shape of what followed so much harder to bear, because loss so rarely announces itself with any of the drama we imagine it will carry. Daniel Voss did not die in a dramatic accident or a sudden illness that gave warning. He went out one spring morning to mend a fence line along the north pasture, complaining mildly of a tightness in his chest that he blamed on the previous night's cold supper. And he simply did not come back for the noon meal. Eleanor found him sitting against a fence post as though he had only paused to rest, his hat still in his hand. His eyes closed like a man deciding whether to nap a little longer before finishing his work. The doctor who rode out from town called at his heart, plainly and without much more explanation than that, and told her, not unkindly, that some men's hearts simply wear out sooner than others. The way a good axe handle can snap clean through even when the wood looked sound. Eleanor was 35 years old and a widow with 2 children under 12, and she discovered within a month of burying her husband that a homestead built on love and stubbornness does not, on its own, satisfy a bank. Daniel had borrowed against the land 3 years earlier, during a drought that nearly cost them everything even with 2 working adults to fight it. And the note had gone to the newly opened Amity Creek Trust, run by a banker named Elias Marsh who had arrived in town not long before with capital nobody quite understood the source of and an appetite for land that seemed to grow keener with every season. The railroad crept closer. Marsh had been patient with Daniel while Daniel lived, extending the note twice with a smile that Eleanor, looking back, would come to recognize as the smile of a man counting interest rather than offering mercy. With Daniel gone, that patience evaporated within weeks. Marsh called on Eleanor personally, sitting stiff and correct in her own kitchen with his hat on his knee, and explained, in the gentle, regretful tone of a man delivering news he has rehearsed, that the full balance of the note was now due, since her husband's death had technically triggered a clause she had never been shown and could not now dispute. He was very sorry. He hoped she understood it was simply business. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought before he left, that the railroad's new survey ran directly through the old mill pond property her father had left her, and that the trust would be glad to make her a fair offer for it, should she ever wish to be rid of a ruin that surely brought her nothing but sorrow. Eleanor understood, even then, sitting across from him with her hands folded tight in her lap so they would not shake, that Elias Marsh had already decided how this story would end. And that her grief was, to him, simply an inconvenience standing between himself and a parcel of land he intended to have one way or another. She did not argue with him that afternoon. She saw him to the door, thanked him for his condolences with a courtesy that cost her more than he would ever know, and then she sat alone at her kitchen table until well past dark, working the numbers over and over on the back of an old grain receipt, hoping each time for a different answer than the one she kept arriving at. By the time the first true blizzard of that winter came howling down off the mountains in late November, burying fence lines and stopping the mail for the better part of a week, Eleanor Voss had sold the milk cow, sold most of the good furniture Daniel's mother had left them, and pared her household down to $11, 2 children. A homestead she now understood she would very likely lose, and one small, stubborn, silent gristmill on the creek that the bank, by an accident of old deeds, could not yet touch. It was into this hard arithmetic that Jonah Pratt arrived, on an evening so cold that the frost had already begun to feather across the inside of her windowpanes by supper-time. He knocked at her door just as the light was failing, a lean, weathered man in his middle 30s with 2 children clinging close behind him, a boy of about 8 and a girl younger still, both of them hollow-eyed with the particular exhaustion of the cold and the hungry. Eleanor had heard of him only in passing, the way one hears of drifters in a small town, a widower, some said, come down from the high country after losing his wife to fever the previous spring, working odd jobs where he could find them and moving on when the work ran out. He did not ask her for charity that night, and she would remember that detail for the rest of her life, because it was the thing that made her open the door wider instead of narrower. He asked her, plainly and without shame, whether she might spare a meal for his children, and told her that in exchange he would work for her family, chop wood, mend fence, do whatever labor a man's 2 hands could offer, for as long as the work lasted and no longer, so that no one could ever say he had taken charity he had not earned. Eleanor looked at the 2 children behind him, at the boy's cracked lips and the girl's too thin coat, and she thought of her own son and daughter asleep upstairs with full stomachs. And she stepped back from the door and told him to bring his children in out of the cold. She fed them that first night from a larder that could not, by any honest reckoning, afford the generosity, and she told herself she would decide by morning what came next. But morning brought a hard truth of its own. Delivered by the wind rattling the shutters and by a sky the color of old iron that promised more snow before nightfall, that a woman alone with 2 children and $11 could very much use. Another set of hands before this winter finished with her. And that a man willing to work for nothing but a meal was not a burden but, whether either of them wished to call it that yet or not, an answer to a prayer she had been too proud to say out loud. She told Jonah Pratt that he and his children could stay through the worst of the weather, that he would work the homestead and mend what needed mending. And that in return she would feed all 4 of them from whatever she had, for as long as she had it. He accepted with a quiet dignity that told her he understood exactly what the arrangement cost them both, and asked, almost as an afterthought, whether there was any work to be had at the old mill down by the creek, since he had trained as a millwright before hard luck and a harder winter had put him on the road. It was the mention of the mill that changed the shape of everything that followed, though neither of them could have known it standing in her cold kitchen that first morning. Eleanor had not set foot inside the building in almost 2 years, not since the last of her father's old customers had finally stopped coming, and she had let herself admit, privately, that the place was more grief than purpose. But something in Jonah's question, the plain, professional interest of a man who saw a broken machine and wanted to know why it was broken rather than simply that it was, stirred something in her that she had thought Daniel's death had buried. For good. She told him yes, there was a mill, and that it had not turned in over a decade, and that she supposed there was no harm in him looking it over. Since the bank could take her fields but had no claim on that one stubborn building her father had left outright to her name. They walked down to the creek together that same afternoon, Eleanor leading the way through snow that came up past her boot tops, Jonah following with his son close at his heel. Curious in the manner of a boy who has learned that curiosity sometimes leads to warmth. The mill stood exactly as she remembered it, the great well silent and rimed with ice, the loft dark and cold. The smell of old grain dust still faintly present under the smell of damp wood and years of neglect. Jonah walked its length slowly, running his hand along the mill race and the gearing with the careful attention of a man reading a letter written in a language he had not used in some time. And Eleanor watched him do it with a lump rising in her throat that she had not expected and did not entirely welcome. He told her, after a long quiet study, that the wheel itself was sounder than she likely believed, that the real damage lay in the gearing and the hopper above the stones. And that with time and the right tools, a man who knew the work could very likely bring the mill back to life. Eleanor almost laughed at the suggestion, not unkindly, but because it seemed, in that moment, like exactly the kind of foolish hope a desperate woman might be tempted to believe simply because she wanted so badly for it to be true. It was 3 days later, while Jonah was working alone in the loft clearing years of debris away from the old hopper housing so he could properly assess the timber beneath it, that he found the first small, strange thing that would eventually unravel into something none of them could have imagined that cold December. Beneath a rotted floorboard near the base of the hopper, where the boards had clearly been cut and refitted by a hand other than the mill's original builder, he found a shallow cavity holding a single tin box, rusted at the seams and sealed with wax gone brittle with age. He brought it down to Eleanor rather than opening it himself, setting it on her kitchen table with the careful respect of a man handling something that plainly did not belong to him. Inside, wrapped in a scrap of oiled cloth that had kept the damp mostly at bay, they found a folded letter in a hand Eleanor did not recognize, along with a small ledger book whose cover bore, in faded ink, the name of a man neither of them had ever heard mentioned in Amity Creek, Josiah Hargrove. The letter, dated some 20 years before Eleanor's own father had ever bought the mill, was addressed to no one in particular, written, it seemed, more as a record for whoever might one day find it than as correspondence meant to be sent. Josiah Hargrove, they learned reading it together at her kitchen table by lamplight while the children slept, had been the original builder of the mill on Amity Creek. A man who had come west with almost nothing and built the mill up from a single millstone and a borrowed wagon into the beating economic heart of a settlement that had not yet earned the name of a town. He wrote of a partner, a man named Silas Marsh, who had put up capital in exchange for a half share in the operation, and who had, over the course of several hard seasons, slowly and carefully maneuvered Hargrove out of his own mill through a series of debts and legal maneuvers that Hargrove, in his own plain words, called nothing less than a theft dressed up in the clothing of a contract. Eleanor felt something cold move through her at the name Marsh, and she looked up to find Jonah watching her with the same recognition already dawning in his own face. The ledger that accompanied the letter was, in its way, more damning still, a careful record in Hargrove's own hand of every bushel he had ground, every debt he had honestly repaid, and every clause Silas Marsh had quietly inserted into their partnership papers over the years, clauses that transferred, bit by bit, control of the mill's land and water rights into Marsh's sole name, until the day came when Marsh informed Hargrove that the partnership was dissolved and the mill, along with the pond and the acreage around it, belonged now to him alone. Hargrove had buried his box beneath the hopper, he wrote in his final entry, not out of madness or spite but because he had no other way left to preserve the truth of what had happened to him. Since Silas Marsh owned the courts of that county as thoroughly as he owned the mill, and no judge within riding distance would hear a poor man's word against a rich one's paper. Hargrove had left Amity Creek not long after, his name slowly forgotten by a town that had never truly known him, and the mill had passed through several hands, each poorer and more desperate than the last, until Eleanor's own father had bought it for $40 dismissive from a man glad to be rid of a building that never seemed to prosper for anyone who owned it. Eleanor sat with that ledger long after Jonah had gone to check on his sleeping children, turning the pages over and over by lamplight, and she understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical in its force, exactly whose grandson now held the note on her own family's land. Elias Marsh had never once mentioned, in all his gentle, regretful visits to her kitchen, that his family's fortune in Amity Creek had begun with the theft of another man's mill. The very mill that now sat, silent and supposedly worthless, beneath her own feet. She did not yet know what to do with the knowledge, whether it could save her homestead or merely satisfy a private, bitter kind of justice, but she knew, as she banked the fire that night and climbed the stairs to check on her sleeping children, that she was no longer merely a widow waiting for the bank to take what little she had left. She was, whether she had asked for the role or not, the keeper of a truth that a whole town deserved to know. News of a kind travels fast even through deep snow, and it was not many days before Elias Marsh himself rode out to the Voss homestead, his fine coat entirely unsuited to the cold, having heard, from whichever quiet source fed him such things, that the widow Voss had a stranger working her mill and had been asking pointed questions in town about old land records and a man named Hargrove. He did not raise his voice that afternoon, sitting once again at her kitchen table with his hat on his knee. But there was a coldness beneath his practiced regret that Eleanor had not heard from him before, a coldness that told her he understood precisely what she might have found. He reminded her, gently, that her note was still due, that the winter would not soften the bank's patience no matter how difficult her circumstances, and that a woman in her position would do well to think carefully before she went stirring up old stories that could only make enemies of the very people whose goodwill she needed most. Eleanor thanked him for his concern with the same practiced courtesy she had used before, and said nothing at all of the tin box now hidden beneath a loose board in her own bedroom floor, though she noticed, as he left, that his eyes lingered a moment too long on the path leading down toward the mill. The following weeks were harder than any Eleanor had known since Daniel's death, not merely because of the weather, though the weather that winter was as cruel as any the oldest settlers could remember, with cattle freezing standing up in the fields and more than one homestead going quiet and cold before help could reach it. Marsh, unable to move openly against a woman whose husband the town had loved and whose grief still commanded a certain public sympathy, worked instead through smaller, quieter cruelties, calling in favors from other merchants so that Eleanor found her credit refused at the mercantile, spreading a rumor that the drifter living under her roof was no honest widower at all but a man wanted for debts of his own further east. A rumor with just enough shading of truth in Jonah's rough circumstances to take root among neighbors already inclined toward suspicion of strangers. Eleanor felt the town's goodwill thinning around her like ice on a pond in a false thaw, felt the weight of eyes that had once offered sympathy now offering only wary distance, and there were nights. Alone after the children slept, when she allowed herself to wonder whether the mill's old secret was worth the cost it seemed determined to extract from her in the present. It was Jonah, in the end, who steadied her through the worst of that pressure, not with grand words but with the same quiet reliability he had shown from the first cold evening at her door. He kept working the mill through weather that would have driven a less determined man indoors for good. Rebuilding the gearing piece by piece with tools he fashioned himself when the proper ones could not be had, teaching Caleb, who had taken to trailing after him with an eagerness that reminded Eleanor achingly of her own father, the names and purposes of every timber and stone. He told her, one evening as they sat going over Hargrove's ledger by the fire, that a man who has lost as much as he had that past year develops a certain stubbornness about what remains. And that he did not intend to let a rumor or a banker's cold smile undo the one piece of honest work he had found in longer than he cared to remember. Eleanor found in his steadiness something she had not realized she still needed, not romance, for neither of them sought nor spoke of any such thing, but the plain, sustaining comfort of knowing she was no longer facing the whole of that winter entirely alone. The turn came at last in early February, on a day when the worst of the season's blizzards finally broke into a hard, clear cold, and the mills will, restored at last by weeks of patient labor, turned for the first time in more than a decade with a groan that carried clear across the frozen creek. Eleanor had gathered, by then, not only Hargrove's letter and ledger but corroborating testimony from the county recorder's own dusty archives. Old deed transfers that matched Hargrove's account precisely, clauses of the very kind he had described inserted quietly into partnership papers that Elias Marsh's own hand had signed. She rode into town herself the following morning, leaving the children in Jonah's steady care, and she laid the whole of it before the circuit judge who happened, by the kind of fortune that feels almost too generous to be believed, to be holding session in Amity Creek that very week. She did not ask for vengeance against Elias Marsh, only for the truth to be entered plainly into the record, and for her own note, given the circumstances of its origin in land unlawfully taken 2 generations before, to be examined with the fairness his own bank had never once extended to her. What followed was not the dramatic public unmasking that a lesser story might have promised, for justice in a small frontier town rarely announces itself with trumpets. It came instead quietly, in the judge's careful review of old deeds against Hargrove's own meticulous record-keeping. In the recorder's grudging admission that the original transfer papers bore irregularities even his own office could not explain away, and in the slow, unmistakable turning of a town's opinion once neighbors who had known and respected Josiah Hargrove's name in their own grandparents' stories began to recall, piece by piece, the old whispers about how the Marsh fortune had truly begun. Elias Marsh did not go to prison, for the theft, however plain on paper, was decades old and its principal actor long dead, but he found, within that single season, that his bank's credit no longer moved so easily through Amity Creek, that depositors quietly withdrew their trust along with their money, and that a man who had built his standing on his grandfather's theft could not simply purchase back a town's goodwill once its true foundation had been exposed to daylight. Eleanor's own note, examined under that same harsh light, was found to rest on land whose original acquisition could not withstand scrutiny, and the trust, eager to avoid further public reckoning, quietly forgave the balance rather than risk the whole of its practices coming under a judge's closer eye. Eleanor did not use what remained of that winter, or the small settlement the trust ultimately offered her in exchange for her silence on certain matters. She chose, in the end, not to accept quietly at all, to enrich herself alone. The mill, restored now and turning steadily on the creek, became once again what her father had built it to be. A place where farmers for miles around could bring their grain and trust an honest measure, and Eleanor made certain, in memory of a man she had never met but whose careful, patient truth-telling had saved her family, that the first sacks ground that spring went not to paying customers but to the poorest households in Amity Creek. Families who had come through that brutal winter as thin and hollow-eyed as Jonah's own children had been the night they first knocked at her door. Jonah Pratt stayed on as the mill's rightful miller, his skill finally given a home worthy of it, and his children grew that following year in a town that had, almost without noticing the change in itself, become a little kinder than it had been before. We began this story by telling you that Eleanor Voss was 36 years old, a widow with 2 children and a debt she could not pay. Standing at the edge of a ruin everyone else had already given up on. We told you she bought nothing that winter, only kept what her father had left her, because sometimes the thing worth saving is not purchased at all but simply refused to be abandoned. The secret waiting inside that old mill was never gold, though it was worth more than gold to the people it finally reached. It was the truth of a wronged man's name. Patiently preserved through decades of silence until a woman stubborn enough to keep faith with a broken building finally gave that truth a voice again. Eleanor Voss did not restore the mill to make herself wealthy. She restored it because her father had taught her that nothing overlooked is truly worthless, only waiting, and because a stranger's cold, honest offer at her door one December evening had reminded her that the same was true of people. Thank you for spending this quiet evening with us and with Eleanor Voss, and with a mill on Amity Creek that the whole world had once called foolish. If her story moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need to hear tonight that overlooked things are not always worthless things. And that the harshest winters sometimes carry their own strange mercy hidden inside them. Before you go, we would love to know, what is a time you found value in something, or someone, that everyone else had already written off? Tell us in the comments below, we read every one. Until next time, stay close.